Smart stuff. Tonight, President Trump is in London, as aforementioned, talking to European leaders about NATO. Mr. Trump first paid a visit to the royals, including a meeting with the future King of England. He met with Prince Charles. He met with his wife Camilla at Buckingham Palace. And then it was on to 10 Downing for a reception with NATO leaders from throughout Europe. Mr. Trump first met with, foremost, with NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg. Then he met with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. However, the big newsmaker was Mr. Trump's meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron, where the two men sparred. Macron said something interesting in this meeting. I don't know if anybody else caught this, but I was monitoring it, sitting in my office, and I found this really fascinating when Macron said this. He suggested to Mr. Trump that the real problem with NATO comes down to this question. And he said it. He looked over at Mr. Trump and said these words: "Who is our enemy today?" That's what he said. He looked at Trump and said, "Who is our enemy today?" Think about that. The leader of one of NATO's founding countries, France, is questioning publicly for the whole world to see and hear, for what reason does NATO still exist today? Because that's really what he was asking, no? With more on this, let's turn over to RT correspondent Alex Mihailovich. He's been following this story for us. What do you make of that? Did that question or that comment strike you as much as it did me as you were listening to that news conference between these two world leaders, Alex?
Well, did it strike me at the same time, you know, whether the French are the ones that are pushing about talking about Russia when it comes to who's the enemy of NATO.
Right.
But really, who is the enemy of NATO, right? So that is a great question. And this is what's happening. This is sort of a pattern that we saw during this summit, starting with Macron. These people are showing disappointment in the organization, in their membership in the alliance. So Macron's saying, really, well, the bottom line there, what is our strategy? What is our strategy? Who do we fight? Who are we fighting? How do we fight terrorists? How do we fight terrorists when one day we're fighting alongside the Kurds and the next day one of our NATO members is fighting the Kurds? So strategy is a big key there. The second factor here that many are talking about, including President Trump, is money. Who's pulling their weight in this organization? And he's complaining about that constantly, and for good reason. Look, out of all the countries, when it comes to military funding, the U.S. makes up 70% of all military funding in NATO. Now, to be fair, the U.S. is the biggest buyer of military equipment on the face of this planet, so obviously the numbers are going to be different. But when you go to NATO specifically, 22% of the NATO budget, which includes clerical, which includes summits, which includes all these different things, those numbers, so 22% the U.S., and then up to 25% would be France, UK, and Germany altogether. So you see that the Americans are actually pulling more weight than anybody else there. Now, we're talking about disappointments here. Well, there's some people that are quite happy with NATO. That would be the UK's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, for one. Here he is.
This is one of the most successful alliances in military history. Nothing like it in the last 500 years in terms of the peace that it has delivered. The UK is at the heart of it. We're the second biggest military player in NATO, and it's a great advantage to this country.
Okay, NATO's never had to defend itself from anything, so we don't know really how good it is at that. Maybe it's deterrent. It could be deterrent. You know, we have a lot of member states here, so that could be the big thing here. But really, what has NATO done to date? They've attacked sovereign nations such as Serbia and Libya and Iraq, who were no threat to any NATO countries whatsoever. But is NATO discussing this? No, they have more important things to talk about, like dysfunction within NATO, and of course, underfunding, two hot topics that Macron was talking about. Here's President Macron of France.
I knew that my statements created some reactions and shake a little bit. A lot of people. I do stand by. And I have to say, when you look at what NATO is and should be, first of all, this is a burden we share. And President Trump just reminded you some figures, and the fact that this is perfectly true, that the US overinvested decades after decades, and it is #1 by far. And I do share the statement. That's why I'm a strong supporter of a stronger European component in NATO, which is exactly what we are doing.
So here we see some infighting. We know that there's infighting in NATO, obviously. President Trump was really critical of the French president's harsh words. He even called NATO brain dead at one point. Macron also tried to make it clear that, you know what, NATO does have one thing it needs to do, that's clear up ISIS. But Trump's comments here, he is talking about Europe, France, and ISIS. This is a good one.
We have a tremendous amount of captured fighters, ISIS fighters, over in Syria, and they're all under lock and key, but many are from France, many are from Germany, many are from UK. They're mostly from Europe, and some of the countries are agreeing. I have not spoken to the president about that. Would you like some nice ISIS fighters? Yeah. I can give them to you. You can take everyone you want.
There he is, Trump punching away. Are we going to go back to freedom fries and freedom toast? Just maybe, because Trump doesn't like the French very much. He's also talking about, you know what, he's saying, you know what, this is not just about NATO. Trump is making a point of talking about trade here. He's saying that he's going to be punishing the French, taxing their wine. He's saying Europe has treated America unfairly, and it's time that that deal is settled as well. America wants, a better deal with Europe when it comes to trade as well.
And as the town barker in the circus once said, let the games begin. Thank you, Alex Mihailovich. Very comprehensive, good report. Well done.